This podcast is a production of OPENPediatrics, a free online resource for health professionals' education. Visit openpediatrics.org for more.
I'm Tracy Wolbrink, a pediatric intensivist at Boston Children's Hospital, and welcome to the World Shared Practice Forum. I'm joined here today for the part 2 of Podcast on PICU podcasts with a number of the top podcasters in PICU today. And I'm just going to have each one of them go around so you can hear their voices and state who they are and which podcast they represent.
I'm Zach Hodges. I am in my final year of critical care medicine fellowship at the University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas. And along with Alice Shanklin, I produce the PedsCrit podcast.
I'm Alice Shanklin. I'm finishing my critical care fellowship at Children's National Hospital this year and soon to be a critical care attending at Cohen Children's Medical Center in New York. I produce the PedsCrit podcast with Zach.
I'm Erin Bennett. I'm a pediatric intensivist and almost associate professor at Arkansas Children's Hospital, and I do the audio summaries for Society of Critical Care Medicine and the Pediatric Critical Care Medicine Journal.
Hi, I'm Greg Kelly. I'm a pediatric intensivist at Sydney Children's Hospital Network Westmead in Sydney, Australia, and I help run the Pediatrica Intensiva podcast.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Mack. I'm a peds intensivist and professor of pediatrics at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, South Carolina, and I am now working in the quality and safety, high reliability space for the Vizient Safe and Reliable team. And I am one of the hosts for FCICM's podcast, where authors published in PCCM and CCM are interviewed about their manuscripts.
I'm Rahul Damania. I'm a pediatric intensivist at Cleveland Clinic Children's, and together with Pradeep Kamat, we produce a case-based podcast known as PICU Doc on Call.
Hi, I'm Peta Alexander. I'm a pediatric cardiologist and intensive care physician at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, working with Tracy. Thanks so much for having us.
Well, thank you, everyone. So I think today we're going to be talking about a how-to guide for podcasts. So if you're interested in podcasting, this episode is for you. We're going to share some of the practical tips, tricks, strategies, workflow, and also how to get credit for the podcast that you're doing. Last episode, we talked a lot about how we all got started, what was the inciting reasons and rationale that we began the podcast. And so this podcast, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive and talk about the nitty-gritty of how we actually brought together our co-hosts and our guests and others and began to think about how do we actually operationalize this. Maybe, Greg, you can start. Tell us how you got started with your podcast and bringing on your co-hosts.
Yeah, I think I'd been thinking about it for quite a few years, and I'd actually done a small pediatric palliative care podcast a few years earlier. I guess as I evolved, what I thought of as the podcast really changed, and it was bringing in the co-hosts, Peter and Mike initially, and now Karen, that really changed how it sounded. And it was very simple. I just reached out to the favorite people that I'd ever worked with. I really loved working with Peter and I really loved working with Mike. And I never worked clinically with Karen Chung, but she just impressed me so much when I met her and continues to do so. So it was literally reaching out to my favorite people and saying, hey, I know you've got no time, but if you can join me, every 1 or 2 months and just talk about what you do, then I can do that back end. Yeah, it was reaching out to those people and them all saying yes, amazingly. That is what made it what it is.
How did you convince Dr. Alexander to participate? Was it easy? Was it an immediate yes?
No, look, I'm very conscious that she was extremely busy. Part of our podcast as well is thinking about, like, our scheduling is an absolute nightmare because we're trying to get these people. But thinking about the fact that the people we want to talk to are incredibly busy and how to make it possible for them. And actually part of our whole strategy and sound is about, like, we don't want you to research. We don't want you to write a paper. We're not asking you to do more work because A, you can't do that. But B, that limitation actually leads to the whole point of our podcast, which is like the bar after the conference of telling us what you actually do. So it's thinking about a way that busy people can do it, and then thinking about how I organize the back end to make that possible for Peter and others.
I'm going to tell the story again, Greg, because I remember it differently from that. Greg used to come to 2 conferences a year in North America so that we could share ideas about how things work differently at our different centers now, having studied together pretty hard in Melbourne for our final ICU exam. And we found that actually, while it was great to be at the AHA and PCICS and whatever conference that happened to be this 6 months, it was actually unpacking how you'd incorporate what we were learning or hearing about during the day that made a difference to us, rather than actually sitting in the lecture and looking at the MRI pictures on screen. Just didn't make that much of a difference. And so it was the unpacking that made things so much richer. And so Greg called me when I was in Australia on holidays, on vacation, and said, hey, I've got this idea, and we can bring other people to the bar at the conference. And I was like, okay. And Greg at the time was doing his MBA and had lots of time for creative thinking. It was just brainstorming and was brilliant, even more brilliant than baseline, which is already pretty remarkable. And he said, I've got this idea. We're going to do a podcast and we're going to record it and we're going to share it with the whole world. This is like free open access education. This is a thing. And I was like, nope, I don't have time for that. I've been told, Dr. Bloom, my mentor at Boston Children's Hospital, said I have to say no to everything for 3 months. I'm not saying yes. He didn't let up. And I told him that I didn't really understand what he was asking me and that I needed him to write something down. And so he ultimately sent me a fantastic 3-page protocol of what we're going to achieve. And it was really impressive. And so here we are. And at the time, I don't think it was our intention, honestly, to bring a guest to each episode. Our intention was to have a set of co-hosts that had a pretty good shtick, that bounced off each other pretty well, and that iterated around a topic. And Greg had set it up from the very outset that we'd have seasons of content that built on small aspects that really required deep thinking for expert practice. And so we started recording single ventricle series. So if you're a cardiac intensivist, single ventricle physiology is a big deal. It's all we think about a lot of the day. And getting it right is really important for the outcomes of those patients. And so Greg had broken down into 6 or 7 different concepts within the single ventricle population. And we just about finished recording that series when COVID broke. And we heard from a friend of ours who'd been working in England that one of our colleagues had gone back from England to the north of Italy and was actually in Bergamo right as this thing was rolling through. And so on the day that the JAMA webinar broke, we'd actually been on a call in the wee small hours of the morning before that, talking to the team at Bergamo that ended up being our COVID podcasts that got released as our first season, not because it was our first season of podcasting, but because we hadn't quite finished the single ventricle esoteric tiny little seasons. When COVID hit, everybody needed information. And so to have access to this group who were so thoughtful and so willing to share their time was really impactful for us.
Well, thank you, Greg and Peta, for sharing your story about how you got your most favorite people to come together, and also your thoughts about how to plan your episode. And I'm curious, from another podcast, Alice and Zach, I'm curious how you guys think about your topics, sort of plan your episodes out, think about your guest speakers. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about what goes into the background of your podcast.
Sure. Reflecting on what Greg and Peta just offered, having a conversation on how to getting things done, like that really resonated with me early on too. And the direction that Alice and I took getting started was we wanted a conversation by fellows and for fellows. And I think that still directs how we get things done today. In general, our topics and our episodes start with picking a topic and picking a guest. And we found that we're leaning towards inviting really great educators, really great communicators. And if they're expert in the field, that's fantastic. That's fantastic too. We generally will create learning objectives and send them a script of questions, maybe at least a couple weeks ahead of time. And then we usually record with them over something similar to Zencastr. We use Riverside. And maybe what sets Alice and I maybe a little bit different is that we still do all the audio editing ourselves. I'm not sure if you guys do that. We do all the audio editing ourselves and then publish to Buzzsprout.
And I will jump on that and add 2 key points. Point number 1 is in contrast to Pediatrica Intensiva, we are obviously not experts. And so I think that my number 1 most nervous moment of my first year of fellowship was recording ECMO anticoagulation, because to take it upon ourselves to learn everything about the topic, and that was not a topic I was looking forward to. And then the second thing is I would be remiss if I did not introduce in this public platform the distinguished professor, Dr. Mike Spader, who is the program director at UVA and who saw my CV, had just interviewed Zach and was like, you guys have to meet each other. You're such nerds. So that's how we got started.
I don't know if you know this, but Mike Spader and I were co-residents together on the very first rotation of residency. We were in the NICU together very first day. So I love that.
Well, that'll bond you. That'll bond you.
What I think is so fun, we have all these voices on here, and we have, what Greg and Peter are doing, which I find, as an early fellow, I found that knowledge aspirational, what you guys were discussing. And, Alice and I are working for something, just early on in our fellowship that we thought would probably be best consumed by younger fellows. And maybe as we've progressed, maybe our audience will progress as well. But what I love is just like the multiple voices and the multiple perspectives that we get to share through this medium.
Elizabeth, if you want to talk a little bit, building on this theme of scheduling and picking guests, how do you do that for SCCM podcast?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. So it's a little different because there is the infrastructure of the SCCM team. I'm feeling a little bit fortunate and grateful that there are people out there like you all who are doing it all on your own. You can do it both ways, right? And so I think it's great to sort of talk about a couple of different options. So the organization, so SCCM, decides which articles they want or they feel like are most amenable to this. They reach out to the lead author who might choose one or more co-authors. In general, I think it's best if there's one or two, but I'm impressed, Tracy, that you're able to get all these cats herded for this venue. And essentially, I read the article and come up with some questions. I float them by the authors, and then they say, yep, those are the questions we'd love to answer, or nope. And what I really try to get at is, how did you even come up with this article topic? What was the meeting, whether it was at the bar? Where did that idea come from, to really try to make that relatable, particularly to junior folks who might be considering a career like that? And then really try to tell the stories. So like, how did you decide that you were going to focus on this issue, or where did your career take you, or who nudged you to think about that? So really to try to add the human component, and then to get their take on maybe the pieces that are not in the actual manuscript. And obviously, ideally, to hook people to go read the manuscript. We do try to give like just a nugget of the summary of the manuscript, but really more than that, tell the story behind it. How did you come up with it? What are your plans, next steps, that kind of thing. And then SCCM has the Zencastr account. He graciously gives the host a Yeti mic. And then we do the connecting with the authors and kind of go from there. And then they take care of the editing and the publishing. So it's a fun deal. And I really just try to get to the personal aspects.
I love that. And I think this media is so rich and so wonderful for actually hearing the human voices and hearing the stories behind that. So I definitely appreciate your podcast and listening to all of the experts and why they started their research and all of that. So that's wonderful. Pivot a little bit, Rahul, to you, and think about, one, how you start thinking about your podcast, and also how did you get the word out there? What are some of the strategies that you use to kind of get people to listen to your podcast?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tracy. I definitely think it's been an iterative process, and it started out with just a way for myself and my mentor, Pradeep, who's the co-host of the podcast, to really stay accountable and on top of the literature. What made the experience so fun was the ability for us to really utilize med-ed theories such as active recall and dual processing theory and incorporate it kind of like a playground that we can then produce podcast episodes and then leverage social media. So a good example or a process that we utilize is we try to take, for example, a topic. Maybe it is going to be something that we've seen in the unit recently or that is frequently assessed on the boards, and we try to turn it into a more case-based type of forum with integration of board style multiple choice questions, kind of creating an audio question bank. And what we've really tried to leverage in the past 6 months is taking some of the key points from the podcast, summarizing it, utilizing AI, and then subsequently trying to figure out how can we represent that same audio message in a visual manner. And that's where we've really incorporated the use of infographics. And those infographics have really been the mainstay of how we end up publicizing or calling more attention to the podcast, because then we can filter some of that interest and push it towards the audio forum.
And which venues do you push your infographics on?
So we have started on Twitter or X, but then subsequently we've started to experiment more on Instagram. And I am working on releasing my first TikTok where essentially you can have a green screen in the background and my floating head can explain the infographic step by step. So it's definitely trial and error. And I think I have more of a face for radio, but stay tuned for more infographics and shorts.
Oh boy, Rahul on TikTok. We can't wait.
Are you actually making the infographics with an AI tool?
Not necessarily an AI tool, but a tool that is able to create more medical-based pictures, and that's a BioRender. Many journals also utilize BioRender for use of figures and tables. And you can have more like brains and lungs and all of these more medical images incorporated.
Yeah, right.
And Alice, what about you and Zach? How do you get word out on your podcast?
We asked this question in a listener survey that we put out on X, formerly known as Twitter, last year. And at least 30 to 40% of our listeners just found the podcast because they searched PICU in their podcast app. So I do think that it's genuine, demand driven. I'm a new APP. I'm driving to and from work. I want to expand my knowledge base is the primary way. But I don't know.
Twitter was our primary way of getting the word out, but I perceive that it's fallen off quite recently where there's not as much activity there. So I think there's a space for some kind of social media to come in and really re-engage that med-ed conversation that previously was very active on Twitter.
One thing that we've really tried to leverage is the fact that these podcasts are created and you get a bolus of new listeners as soon as you release a podcast. But how do you create more sustenance and allow people to revisit podcasts? And that's where leveraging social media to repost old podcasts has been a strategy for us. And also in our fellow didactics now, we utilize the podcast to be kind of like a pre-listening or a pre-reading that we assign to the fellows before going into a more flipped classroom case-based type of session.
That's really interesting to hear. I feel like that's where I have struggled the most with continuing to get it out there and how do I attract more listeners. And then, as you said, Alice and Zach, I feel like X initially was really good, and I feel like it's sort of fallen off lately. And maybe not, maybe that's just my perception, but that's something lately I've kind of in my head been like, how can I continue to have interest in this, and how can I also advertise for it? So it's good to hear all of these different ways, because I think it gaining traction and keeping that traction has been where I need a little bit of assistance with that.
And Erin, do you have any idea about who your typical audience is? I'm thinking both you and Elizabeth with the FCICM podcasts and audio summaries. Do you know who's listening? Is it FCICM, PCCM subscribers? Is it anybody? Do you have a sense of who your typical audience is?
I think most of it, for me at least, is the PCCM subscribers and SCCM because they're the most familiar with it. But it is available to anyone. And even in my podcast at the end, I'm like, if you like this, come listen or subscribe, and trying to get more people. But I think people finding out that it even exists sort of starts with the actual subscriber. So I am also open to, trying to find new ways to get it to people that don't necessarily subscribe.
I agree. And I would just add that often it'll land somehow, somewhere on X, formerly known as Twitter, and folks will use the PEDS ICU hashtag. And then we can get data on the hashtag, particularly using Simpler, and Dr. Sean Barnes is typically the one who pushes that out. And so for us data-driven folks, there is a little bit of a way to try to cull through that and figure out if people use the hashtag and if they post it there. And I do also see some of it land on LinkedIn as well. I don't think that's a classic meta platform by any stretch. So I think there are some ways to try to track it down. I don't use another hashtag that would indicate it's a PEDS ICU podcast specifically, but something to think about.
That's great. And, I think we've talked a little bit now about finding our podcast co-host, finding our guests, planning our episode, getting the word out. One of the things is all of this takes time. And I'm curious, if anybody has any protected time at their institution. I'm seeing some nods and some shaking of their heads. Zach, how about you?
With some protected time and maybe a little bit of funds, I feel like Alice and I could have opportunity to create many more episodes. And I think institutions are going to have a hard decision to make. Where do podcasts fit into the traditional scholarship, hierarchy? And, if we find them as important as this field does here today, I think protected time is a logical next step. And I think funds, whether it be from your academic fund or in addition to that, could be a great small investment that could go a long way for many people in this field for their career.
You bring up such an important point, which is academic credit and sort of the thought about podcasts as a scholarly work. And so I'm curious, maybe we could just kind of go round robin and hear what's happening at your institution. How are podcasts being perceived in terms of scholarly work? And are there any strategies that you've used that have been successful in getting academic credit or recognition for yourself or any of your podcast guests? Maybe Erin, do you want to start?
Sure. So I don't have any protected time for it and I don't have any funding, but like Elizabeth, FCICM takes on, they gave me a microphone and then they do all the editing and everything every month. But I do think as far as scholarly work, it is valuable to people at my institution and to others. And they recognize that. I do, like Elizabeth was saying, I look up the hashtag and how many views it's gotten and things like that. And that I put in, I have a separate social media CV and then I also put in my regular CV. So that has helped with that as well. And people are definitely interested. People listen and they disseminate it to people at the institution.
Great.
Erin, can I ask you, you said soon to be associate.
Oh yeah.
So your social media CV, was that a part of your packet?
Yeah, it was a part. I did it kind of separate because I feel like social media CV is kind of a new thing. I don't know, maybe it's not, but and other people can weigh in. But I did it as a separate sheet for a document, excuse me. And then I also put it in my regular CV because I wasn't really sure where it fit. And I know that was something that we talked about with Tracy too, is like, where does it fit and how do you put it on there? I just kind of made up a subheading and put it there. And it was something that I was asked about.
There's a really great article for those of you that are interested in this by Daniel Cabrera and colleagues called More Likes and Tweets, Creating a Social Media Portfolio for Academic Promotion and Tenure. And that group has done a fair bit of work. The emergency medicine group has really done a ton of effort in this space. And they put together sample concepts that you might want to include if you're going to do a social media portfolio, like why did you pick this media? What is your mission statement? And then also using data and metrics to highlight your role, whether you're the podcast host or the editor or your guest or something, and then thinking about the number of followers that you have and the number of listens. And so all of those strategies can be helpful to really describe what your impact and your reach are. If we were to do a podcast and have like 3 listens, that's very different than someone that's getting hundreds of listens or thousands of listens per episode. And so I think being able to share that more broadly so that our promotion and tenure committees can start seeing that this is valuable and also what are some benchmarking, I think would be incredibly helpful. We were going through a similar phase as education portfolios were 20 years ago, when the concept of being an educator as scholarly work was coming into practice, and the education portfolio movement really came out. And so now, this is, I see another feather in that cap, or another tool in our toolkit that we can use to describe the work that we're doing.
Tracy, I'm so thankful that you brought up that article. If I'm remembering correctly, in the article by Cabrera et al., they identify low, medium, high impact, roles. And if I remember correctly, medium was like 5,000 downloads per month, and high might be closer to 20,000. But that's for an emergency medicine audience. And when you compare that to pediatric critical care, I mean, we're 1/10 the size of emergency medicine. So I think like what this field, and probably many faces on this call today, how are we going to define, high impact, and where does that fall in relation to emergency medicine? It has 10 times the listenership.
There's like less than 100 pediatric critical care physicians in Australia, which I try to keep in mind because, you look at, I've got 20 downloads, go, that's not bad, like 20% from Australia. 1/5 of my colleagues are listening to this. That's amazing. But yeah, we are so tiny compared to adult emergency medicine, compared to anything. Like we're a niche of a niche. I think it's important for us all to remember that.
And Greg, how about you? What does your institution feel about podcasts and the recognition that they give you for the work that you're doing? How does that unfold?
Yeah, I mean, we have a fair bit of flexibility around how we have some non-clinical time and some through work, and where I'm able to use some of that time. And I think in terms of the recognition, it's one of those things that's coming. And I think in some ways it's a little bit like the grisly old doctors who all did, 180-hour on-call shifts and think that everyone else should do that. Like, remember that people in academic positions have got there primarily through publishing in traditional media. And so setting up podcasting as a counter to that is not helpful. It helps to explain how podcasting and other newer platforms can amplify and accelerate that message getting out, and how it sits alongside that rather than how it's instead of. And I think it's incredibly helpful to have people like Peta and Karen, for example, who are both doing still lots of traditional publishing. And I'd be interested what Peta thinks about, the role of podcasting sitting alongside what mainstream academic work.
As I hear you all talking about it, I feel like I take the least academic approach to podcasting to any of you, because you're being really thoughtful about how it does fit into that educator role. And I think the analogy to education as genuine academic product is a really good one and really insightful. I feel like actually, rather than adding richness to this discussion, I'm probably a bit more superficial about it. I think that for me, it's much more about translating what's out there into practice. I might read lots of papers, but I don't implement all of the findings into my clinical practice. And that's partly by design, because actually one retrospective observational data set isn't going to change the world for me, and partly by lack of initiative to change a whole system of practice without, a little bit more thought around it and a little bit more team integration. And so I think the podcast is a really neat way to explore different constructs, perhaps, than I would delve into quite so deeply on my own. And again, I'm going to go back to our delirium episode, because I think I learned more in that episode than I've learned from reading delirium papers since fellowship. Like, it was amazing to me. And so that kind of real practice changing, worldview changing discussion and dialogue, I find much more tangible out of the podcast forum than I find out of reading a paper or writing a paper or even doing the research that goes into a paper.
It's kind of like all those conversations that you have as you're getting together your writing group, and being able to expose those kind of conversations for everybody to hear is so valuable.
Yeah, I agree.
Rahul, I'm wondering what your institution feels about podcasts.
Well, Cleveland Clinic as a whole and as an enterprise has really leveraged the fact that podcasting is a mainstream way for people to not only understand esoteric like PICU topics, but just general health topics as well. And so one of the things which I early on, when I joined the institution, really started to become fascinated with is if we can synergize forces with an institution like Cleveland Clinic and then disseminate some of this knowledge, how would that go and what would be the outcome? And one of the areas and somewhat barriers that ended up kind of surfacing is the fact that when you are going to be with a large institution, there's going to be a lot of red tape in terms of what you can say, how you can say it, the pace at which these scripts and the thoughts are going to be approved. And that's something that was very insightful for me And so, with regards to podcasting at our institution, we definitely at the medical school and promotions level, we now have more of a audiovisual based CV, which you can cite in a scholarly manner, so to say, with the links up to the podcast, which has been really nice. And I think it's just now starting to become more of a culture shift that compared to maybe a PubMed publication, at times a podcast may have more listenership, more eyes, more ears to that specific idea that has relatively at times been peer reviewed and vetted by experts incorporating the emerging literature. And this is something that I think in the next 10 years, we're going to have a very different conversation surrounding that thought.
Can I just add something to that? It strikes me that we kind of need a multimodal altmetrics kind of score, because I think altmetrics has become something that we all look at and reference and recognize as a bit more reflective of the exposure that your work is getting than citation score, which is delayed. Even if my paper is going to be hugely cited, something I'm yet to experience, but even if it is going to be, that's a many year process rather than I can see the impact that my work is having in the next year or two. I just wonder whether there might not be a path to expanding the altmetrics score effectively to also reflect the academic productivity associated with podcasting or webinars or any of the multimodal work that's going on. I don't know who runs altmetrics. Do you know?
Can I actually ask what that is? I've looked at a lot of podcast downloads, but I've unfortunately haven't had a bunch of paper reads. What is an altmetrics?
So altmetrics is alternative metrics, and it's really trying to get a sense of what is sort of the impact of traditional scholarly work. A work needs to have a digital object identifier or a DOI number, and then it can be sort of indexed within altmetrics. And so if you ever see those little wheels next to a journal and there's different multicolors, what those wheels reflect are how much media interest has been distributed by this journal article. So if it's been tweeted, or if it's on YouTube, or if there's blogs written about it, or if it's referenced in news or other media, it will get indexed and you'll get a score and a benchmark compared to other journal articles from that journal, from those kinds of journals, from that type of work, and from the similar time. And so it really helps to kind of build out the impact of traditional work. But one of the challenges I think that Peta was bringing up is that there's not like an altmetric score for things like podcasts or YouTube videos or any of those kind of materials. And Brent Thoma and Teresa Chan in Canada, they're both emergency medicine physicians, have been doing a ton of work thinking about social media and other digital scholarship and some of the ways that we can get academic recognition. And so they've created a social media index. And I think they just rebranded it Digital Scholarship Index. And so they're trying to think about some of the metrics that we can gather, like listens, subscribers, followers, et cetera, and putting that together into some sort of score. And so I would say that they're definitely paving the way forward. I actually saw an H index for YouTube videos, a bibliometrician talking about a number of views that if you have 10,000 views on YouTube, that maybe that is like one video of 10,000 views, H index of 1. So I think certainly a lot of work to be done in this space to really bring the recognition for the hard work that's being done.
But I think it would also be good to have something that translates across the different modes of reaching people, because I agree, like having some sort of index to reflect the impact of the work is better than not having something. But having an overall H index or citation or whatever that also reflects the, almost like your college packet in the US has got, I volunteer and I've got great grades and I've done great internships and I do everything. I'm like the universal man or universal non-gendered, whereas there's not something like that. I've got my H score and I've got my citation index and I've got my altmetrics, and it'd be neat to have something that just rolls it all into one, like a CanMeds model.
Thank you for saying that, Peta. I feel like there's a need within academic medicine to quantify not just the things, but the impact of the things. And so I think that is going to be incredibly powerful. And I think back on my own journey of this media as a scholarly product. And my first real loves outside of academic sort of clinical practice were advocacy and quality and safety work. And I actually, within the AAP section on critical care, with a couple of amazing colleagues, put together sort of a how do you turn advocacy work into a scholarly product kind of module available for folks. And I learned a lot along the way, that there's an education portfolio article and sort of body of literature advocacy, the social media piece. And so a lot of people thinking about how to really make valuable in the eyes of the deciders, specifically around promotion, truly this kind of non-traditional academic product. And there are lots of different platforms out there that institutions use around promotion. The one that we use and institutions use is Enterfolio. I don't know what you have at your institutions, but there is a media section there. And so that got me thinking, okay, I'm going to have a media section within my actual personal CV that I just keep my own version of. And then I started to think, okay, I should really divide this. So on my personal, I have podcasts, I have newspapers, I do a lot of media work within the advocacy space and various different types of media on there. But in the Interfolio, at least at the moment, and the version that we use, there's just media. And so I said, okay, well, we'll just put the podcast there. And that is the type of media. So I think, institutions and the folks that sort of create the platforms for that type of document for promotion are starting to realize that we need a more inclusive space.
And we've been very lucky here at Harvard Medical School that Grace Huang is our Dean of Faculty Affairs, and she was the editor of MedEd Portal for a very long time. And so she's been instrumental to incorporating some of these kinds of digital scholarship works into our Harvard CV. And so right now, podcasts are explicitly listed on educational materials to the patients and the lay audience, but there's also under non-peer-reviewed scholarship as well as peer-reviewed scholarship opportunities for you to put these digital scholarship works there. And so I think the more that we as individuals that are doing this work can put them in our CV in the right places with these surrounding metrics that we've been talking around, then, at least our promotion and tenure committees can start having that conversation. And over years, hopefully we can build this as a robust scholarly activity that is recognized and sort of understood for its impact. And as Peta mentioned, if we could think about a unifying score or something that could be benchmarked, I think that would be incredibly helpful, because I think Zach and Greg, you mentioned such important points about the small size of our community. And, it's just impossible to benchmark compared to larger internal medicine or emergency medicine or others. So I think these are really important conversations to be having.
And just to reflect on what you said, Tracy, you did a remarkable job in your team sending us around the citation for our podcast from a couple of months ago. And at the time I received that, I thought, my goodness, that's brilliant. And we should be doing the same thing for the people that we invite to our podcast. But we've never done that, because I actually, despite being at the same institution as you and dutifully recording something about the podcast on my CV, I hadn't ever done it in nearly such a professional way. I learned something with that, and we'll share that with our invited guests moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Peta. One of the things that we do is we do think that this is so important for our audience. And so every year we also send out a digital scholarship portfolio where every author of every video or any academic work that is published on OPENPediatrics, we send that out to all the authors with a citation, with the number of views that they have, so that when they can put that on their CV, they can have some evidence and background of that. I hope that that's helpful. We have heard a lot of people say that this was really instrumental and really useful for putting it on their CV. And I will say, Peta, there are many people in our institution that you'd be surprised that reach out to us every year to update their CV with new numbers and new metrics. And so I think it's getting out there, and the more that we can do, the better.
And for my own institution's P&T committee, they were like, we didn't really think about it. And then we saw your packet and clicked on these links. It's a little bit novel, but it is gaining traction and people are recognizing it. And they were like, that's pretty cool. So at least people are recognizing it and understanding it is a good piece of scholarly work. And as Peta said, we've all learned something from all of our podcasts that we wouldn't know otherwise.
It is really interesting to me, though, because I do work, as Greg said, in a lot of fairly standard databases and registries, and I co-PI a clinical trial that's ongoing in ECMO at the moment. So I do a lot of fairly general academic work as well. It's really fascinating to me because the biggest excited impact that people get when they come and find me at a conference or whatever is about the podcast. And Greg's been there for some of that. People will come running up to say hello for the podcast. And I get to introduce them to Greg, who's actually the brains and all of the work behind the podcast, but somehow they recognize me associated with it. It is pretty impactful in terms of reaching an audience in a way that I just don't think regular scientific papers are anymore.
Getting close to the end of this episode. One final question, a quick round robin for everybody on the call. One final pearl that you want to share with others that you think has really contributed to your podcast success. So your piece of advice, your final tip, or your final pearl for our audience. Zach, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Yeah, my tip would be vulnerable and relatable. So when Alice and I started our podcast, we had high levels of imposter syndrome. We started publishing on day one of fellowship, and we were so intimidated.
I maintain that was legitimate imposter syndrome.
Yeah. And I think that listeners out there also have a similar, at various stages have that same imposter syndrome, vulnerability. And I hope that comes through in our conversations, that we're not afraid to be vulnerable. And we hope that we are relatable.
Thank you so much. Erin, how about you? What's one pearl you have for those that are listening?
Yeah, I think for me, it would be if you have an idea to ask around, because you'll probably find somebody that will help you with it. When I first had this idea, I didn't really know what to do with it. And then asked a few people, someone got back to me, and then it sort of took on a life of its own. And here I am today. So not to give up on it, just to keep going with it and ask around, and someone will help you. And there's lots of support.
That's great. Greg, how about you?
I think just be yourself. I think one of the things that sort of Peter mentioned, other people have mentioned, that one of the strengths of podcasting is that people connect with it in a different way. And I think people connect with you being a person, rather like academic writing, for example, is about writing in a very standard manner and taking yourself out of it. But I think the advantage of this kind of format and the benefit is that you can be a person and people connect with that in a different way. So you can still be professional and academic, but have a personality and let that show.
Elizabeth, how about you?
One of the questions that we had batted around as well as a group was, how does this make you a better guest yourself? Having been on both sides of it, I think sharing with the guests that join graciously, give their time, please don't read, but just tell the story. And preparation is totally welcome and appropriate. And I'm happy to, share some questions in advance and all that kind of good stuff. But it's so much more authentic and relatable, as Zach said, and just don't worry about the editing process. That will all be taken care of, but you don't want to sound like a robot. Just be yourself and tell the stories behind it. And I think that is what people really want to hear.
How about you, Rahul?
Tracy, you probably know I'm a nut for acronyms and mnemonics. So I have a kind of 3C pearl that I'll share with everybody. So number one is clarity. Try to really deliver your message in a very intentional manner. Number two is collaboration. Get as many people involved. I have been fortunate to even recruit some residents to help me create infographics, which has been a great experience. And the last one is consistency. This is all about iterative efforts, and some episodes are going to hit, others are not. And so if you can really remember clarity, collaboration, and consistency, I think that that's one step for a successful podcast.
Great. Peta, how about you?
I think that one of the things that would be easy to miss, given our kind of easy dialogue and chatter over the course of the last 2 chats that we've all had together, is the deliberate preparation that went into both planning where your podcast was going to land, what audience you were aiming at and what tone you're aiming at, and then preparing your guests appropriately. So some people have said, we send out a list of questions in advance, and if people don't want to answer those questions, we look at those again. We send out a fairly generic spiel that says, please don't read up, please don't reference anything. We just want you to be the expert talking about your practice. And neither of those are right or wrong. They're different, and they're deliberately different because we're aiming for something different from our guests. And that level of deliberation and planning and decisiveness really sets up the podcast to have their own character for success. And so I think that would be easy to miss from our easygoing conversation, that actually everybody on the panel had been very thoughtful and deliberate and active in those decisions that they made in setting up what they were hoping to land as their podcast. So while we're having easy banter, there's a lot of forethought and planning that goes into all of this.
Thank you, Peta. And Alice, you have the hardest job, the last one, the last pearl.
Zach and I, we were doing it for like maybe 6 months. And then we had a conversation driven by Zach. And he was like, if we're doing it right, we're not talking for most of the episode, right? I was like, right. And he was like, and we both have these over $100 microphones, right? And I was like, right. And so then we started getting really specific about making sure that our guests have like a headset or something. And at least I hope that helped bump up our audio quality.
Thank you all. This has been incredibly useful and such a fun conversation to have. And I really hope that those of our listeners that are out there that are thinking, oh, I'm curious about podcasting, I'm sort of interested, now may have more of a push to just go out there and do it. I'm going to volunteer for all of us. I think anybody that's interested can feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be excited to chat with you as a listener that is interested about all these strategies. And hopefully we've been able to share some of the strategies, planning. I was taking a few notes throughout this podcast, and just a few things that really resonated with me are finding friends to co-host and be your guests, be authentic, get personal, make sure that you're staying on top of the research and the literature, because that makes you a better host and brings on the right guests. Think about using different modalities to get your word out, and then make sure that you put this on your CV and help your guests to also get this on their CV for credit. So I just want to say thank you to all of you today as podcast hosts, and look forward to hopefully continuing this in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
What a fantastic panel. Thanks so much for bringing it together.
This has been a production of Open Pediatrics. Check out the description box to view the resources and journal articles referenced in this podcast. To hear more podcasts like this one, log on to openpediatrics.org.